Welcome back to episode 9 of the D-League. This is Jan, and I'm here with Bilal again, as usual, just the two of us. And today we're going to continue talking about tools that you can use during development. But last week, we talked about game engines. So, nice to have a game engine, but what do you do with a game engine without models or 2D sprites that actually show your game? So today we're going to talk about this stuff: 3D modeling, 2D art creation, and also animation. And so let's get started, Bilal. Let's start with 3D modeling first. I think that's probably the most important asset in today's gaming industry to create 3D models. As well, you still have 2D games, but 3D modeling is kind of easier, and you don't have to do all the animation by hand like in 2D stuff. So I guess probably most of our listeners will want to do 3D modeling. Okay, so Bilal, do you have a tool that you would want to introduce or talk about first?
I guess. Do you want to hop in through each tool? Then maybe. So why don't we go ahead and bring up? We can talk about Blender, I guess, because that's kind of the go-to, I think, for indie development, because Blender can, unlike a lot of free software, Blender does actually let you get kind of AAA quality, because you can use whatever shaders and anything in it, and it's very easy to mod. So there's a very big community that helps make Blender a tool that you can use for AAA productions. It's just not a standard in the AAA industry, so that's why it's kind of a big, popular tool for 3D in indie development. So that's why. So people can really get started with free stuff for the most part, and that's why Blender is a really nice tool in that regard. What do you have any notes on Blender, I guess, before we continue into more depth?
I think the good thing about Blender is that, as you said, there is a community that's motivated to help you learn the program. So you have a lot of tutorials that you can look up. For example, if you say, hey, I want to create text in 3D, like you see those movie intros where 3D text is scrolling into the screen or maybe rotating, like the, what is it, Universal Studios intro, where you have the Earth and then the text scrolls down. You can do stuff like that with Blender, and there are tutorials for that, how to create text or a title in 3D, and then what you can do with it. And also Blender also, it's not just modeling, so you cannot only create 3D models, but you can also apply textures to the models. And also you can create animations for the models. Of course, it depends on what you're going to use out of the model for.
Yeah.
If, let's say, the game engine supports the Blender file types that you can export the models as. But I guess if you are completely new to 3D modeling, then it's a good start to use Blender, because, like you said, it's free. You have the community tutorials. You can pretty much do everything in Blender. So yeah, there there's a lot of things you can learn, or maybe if you just want to give it a try and see if 3D modeling is well fun for you, and maybe like if you're talented at it, then I guess Blender is a good starting point in that regard.
Yeah, I think, I guess kind of to cover some more features of Blender, the things, I guess, yeah, the things that are actually pretty attractive about it are um, probably the keyboard shortcuts. I guess I'm not going to go too in depth into this, but basically when you're using a computer, this is programmer advice, I guess, but when you're using a computer in general, the more you can do with the keyboard, like the faster your workflow is going to be, because of how the mouse is fundamentally imprecise. So pressing a keyboard key is a lot more precise than moving a mouse to clicking on something, and that's why if you have a lot of keyboard shortcuts muscle memorized, you can work a lot faster. And that's something that's really attractive about Blender, is that all of the actions are, they're open to having keyboard shortcuts applied to them, and there are a lot of defaults for that. And if something doesn't have a keyboard shortcut for it, you can hit the space bar, which will open up the command palette, and that lets you type in the name of a command to do something if you either forgot the keyboard shortcut or you didn't apply one. So, and alongside that is also, yeah, we talk. Yeah, I don't know if we said animation, but I think most nowadays 3D tools, actually, yeah, I mean 3D tools you would expect to use for either film or games. I mean they always have. Most of them will now have like Blender, Maya, and 3ds. They'll have animation tools and texturing tools. So that stuff is, you'd expect that. One thing that's interesting. Oh, sorry. Actually, before I go into that, is the other thing that's really nice about Blender is how we said it was easy to mod and script. It uses Python, which is a programming language that's not very hard to learn. It's pretty simplistic, and it's very powerful, so you can use Python to make your own features in Blender, if you want to do multiple things or create new features in Blender. And they can actually go into the source code because it is open source. So that's another nice thing about the community. And I think finally, yeah, what I wanted to say, I've never actually used it, but Blender has a game engine as well built in. So I guess if you want to make simplistic games and you don't want to learn a different software, then you can probably just use the Blender game engine as well. But yeah, I mean, I haven't used it myself, so I can't say whether it's good or bad or a great idea. But I think it always is easier if you don't have to learn external software. It's just not a commonly used. It's not an engine that's commonly used, I think, in commercial projects. So that's why it's not really something you'd often hear about.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think yeah, that covers everything. That's.
I guess
Oh,
if
not
you just
everything,
want
but
to,
Go ahead.
if you just want to give your model a test run, then maybe you can just hook up something real fast in the game engine,
Yeah.
and then if you say, yeah, okay, that actually looks all right, I'm gonna use that, then you can just export to your proper game engine that you're gonna use afterwards.
Yeah, I guess you could also probably just even copy and paste a script like really quickly. Like if you wanted to put spaceship controls and test drive your thing, then there you go. Copy and paste a script onto your model and see how that works.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that covers most. Obviously, not literally everything, but I think the most key features. Obviously, there's keyframe animation. That's kind of a standard. I guess if people don't really know much about 3D in general, I think there's a brief workflow that you would kind of expect is, you'd move around vertices and faces of geometry, or subdivide them into multiple faces, and manipulate a model to make it look like something different. or you can sculpt it kind of like you're painting in 3D. Um, yeah, and then once you're done with making it look how you want it to look, you might want to, apply texture to make it differently colored. And even before, and as you're doing that, you'll probably choose a shader for a material, which is a material is, I guess, how the model surface will look and how it will be lit up. I guess the shader is kind of what dictates how the lighting is going to look when it hits the faces of that model.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, and then and so the material will specify a shader and a texture or color for what the model will actually have on the surface. So and then so once you reach that point in time, point in development actually, once you have the shader added, you either you want to apply a texture somehow. So either you could hand paint it in Blender, because there's actually the 3D painting option, and you could technically use a mouse or a tablet. I guess we'll probably get more into tablets in a little bit once we head to the texturing section.
Yeah, exactly.
But so, yeah, you have the option of either hand painting or texturing otherwise. So like other, I guess, 2D art tools could just you could import the images into Blender. And then once you're done texturing, maybe you probably would animate it at that point. You might actually make the animation before the texturing. I mean, you would agree it probably doesn't really matter if you texture first or animate, right?
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Because, well, if you do the animation and then apply texture, it's not like, you need to redo something. You just need to, either the texture needs to look good, or it doesn't. But it does not collide with the animation. Like if you do an animation, then it's always the same.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you'll actually see more models that are untextured and animated too. So the people will do either one. Like if it's going to be in a game, obviously it needs to be animated and textured. So you depending on whatever your workflow is, you'll do one of them first.
Yeah. I guess you would rather go for animation first, because if you say no, the foot seems too big when walking, or the head, maybe that's too big or too small, and then you just do adjustments, and then you say, okay, now I'm fine with the proportions of the model, and now I'm gonna texture.
Yeah. I guess if you still want to manipulate it, then yeah, that's a good point actually. I'm sure people don't bother with that anyway, though. I think it would mostly matter with a more precise model like a humanoid or a character rather than something mechanical. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I guess to kind of talk about how the animation workflow goes. So there's obviously the option of motion capture, which you won't be doing as a beginning studio. That's something that's more expensive because you need to worry about all the hardware. So I don't think we'll really get into motion capturing, but
it's getting cheaper though.
Yeah, that's true.
I think.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't actually know anything about it. If you have any details.
I think they are working on motion capturing from something like the Kinect camera.
Oh yeah, I've seen
Something
that.
like that, because it's also kind of analyzing the room and where your arms are and where your head is. So like when you're doing motion capture right now professionally, then you will have these actors with these balls attached to their limbs and hands and so on, so they can they check where the balls are moving. So if you throw a punch, and then they see, okay, your shoulder is going up and your ankle is moving forward, and then your hand is also moving forward. So they just use the balls to, capture the motion. And then they use that data to apply it to a model, a 3D model, pretty much.
Yeah, I've seen when people are moving around. Actually, I'm trying to remember. There was an interesting thing with, I think people hooked up the Kinect and then put it into just software that would look at. I think, yeah, what was it? I guess it would, the camera would see some sort of movement. I think it could go from video to motion capture actually, but I don't know how accurate you can get that to be with just one camera. I know that Killing Floor 2 was motion captured after the first one obviously wasn't, and it doesn't look that great, but the second one, looked a lot better, and it was the updated Unreal Engine, and then they motion captured it because they had the funds at that point, and so they had a bunch of, I'm not even sure how it works, but they had that outfit on where they have a bunch of, I guess, nodes attached to them, and they'll detect like the movement between limbs and whatnot. Yeah. So obviously, motion capturing is technically an option. I think most people, obviously, most one developer teams or two developer teams and so on, will probably use keyframe animation, which is where you record, moving pieces of a model, and then making sure that at a certain point in time, the model will interpolate to that position or that scale and so on. So yeah, commonly you'll have that keyframe animation, then export a model. Once you're done with all those, into probably an FBX or some other, I guess, model extension. I think FBX is common because, FBX is the standard. I think because it can have animations alongside it, so it's not just the model. So yeah, that's kind of how the workflow / pipeline works, I guess. If you're doing everything for the model, sometimes people will just model it, and then they'll pass it down to an animator, and then they'll pass it down to a texture, or and
of course, if you have the guys that can do it, or you actually know somebody or you have somebody you work with, but some game projects are like a one-person project, then of course you have to do everything yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
So
yeah, I mean, I guess. So I mean, we kind of covered like 3D pipeline, but that's Blender in general. So
yeah.
I mean, yeah, I guess. Do you have any more to say about Blender? Or I guess we could move on to.
No, not really. Please move on to the next program.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess we'll briefly. I guess one like good question is, why is Blender not the only thing that's used if if it's free and open source and super great? And I mean, I don't know the big feature differences between Blender and 3ds or anything, but yeah. So I'll just say 3ds Max is kind of the game development standard for props and things like mechanical, like vehicles and level objects. So yeah, I mean 3ds has kind of been there for a while, and so it's stuck there. And Maya is the standard for like film or character animation. So typically something that's more animation heavy, like I don't know, a humanoid or some platformer character, is something you'd probably end up doing in Maya or Blender. And then something like a vehicle, like a tank, would be done in 3ds or Blender. So I mean, that's kind of how the standards are. That will obviously change depending on who's working. I think it's most important to be able to specialize in one of them, and probably specialize like in, I don't know, either vehicles or characters or something like that. I think it depends on what your goals are, though. So, yeah, I mean that kind of covers, I guess, my knowledge on all of them. I know I used 3ds briefly, and I enjoyed using Blender more. I think Blender is more intuitive for computer users. I think 3ds has more of a learning curve, although all of them will have some big learning curve if you're new to modeling in general. So yeah.
It's like drawing, right? When you draw by hand, you need to practice to actually get good at it. And I think it's the same for even 3D tools. for me, when I tried Blender, at first it was just like trying what you can do, like moving vectors and deleting them, and like making round edges and stuff like that. And then when you kind of know what you're doing, and like you said, the shortcuts, then I think at that point, when you know a bit about 3D modeling or what you're actually doing, then it's more fun, because you just imagine something, maybe a torso of a mech or something like that, and then you say, okay, it in your head it looks like that, and then you just with 3D modeling, it's kind of like creating a sculpture. You start with, let's say, a square, and then you add vectors and you move them, and then you reshape them, and then you can quickly change the look of things. Like you say, no, that's too blocky. I want it more round. Then you just make it more round.
Yeah.
So it's fun to just play around, but it can also be quite frustrating if you don't get what you're doing. So I guess even for 3ds Max and Maya, if you have no experience in 3D modeling, then maybe you should look up tutorials, maybe even on just like the features, what the programs can do, how you use them, and when you should use them. That's much more fun. It's if I can throw out a comparison, just imagine playing some random game and you don't know what you're actually supposed to do. Nobody told you, and you don't know how to control your character. Then at some point you say, yeah, okay, this sucks.
Yeah.
But if you get an introduction, like, okay, you need to do that, and that's the purpose, and you can do all that stuff, and it's gonna be great. If you when you know how to do it, you will have a lot of fun. Then I guess you will be motivated for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think art in general is kind of like that. At least if you didn't start when you're a kid, then and you have to learn art. At least for me, it's kind of an experience where it's like, I mean, learning new stuff is great. Like, for example, like I've been a programmer for like 10 years. So I mean, when I learn a new language or, program in some new way, that can be exciting because I know the fundamentals. But then learning something new in that regard is, fun, because I guess it's kind of like a not so fresh start, but a new start. But once you're learning something like art and you weren't really an artist before, that can be frustrating, because you kind of have that concept of, okay, well, it's like you're back in school again and you have to learn everything all over again, and there's no technical list of things to do to get something done. And I guess you can learn the tools, and you can do a thing. Like, you can, if you want to make, I don't know, maybe a table, you might have a standard for making a table, but then there's no like step-by-step technical list if you want to make something look a different way. Like, if you've been modeling, I don't know, ants your entire life, and now you want to model bees, well, you don't have a technical step-by-step, I guess, plan for making a bee. Now you have to like learn a new way of doing that. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just something to keep in mind, is how frustrating that can get. So people...
I guess everything about game development can be frustrating, because at some point, if you imagine a learning curve, then I guess you will probably start to learn, well, kind of quickly, because you don't know anything. But when you think you know something about what you're doing, then, well, you're maybe not even in the middle of the learning curve. You're maybe at a quarter. So you still have a steep learning curve to climb, kind of. Or at least that's my experience. That you get into stuff quickly, and then you say, yeah, okay, so that's how it works in general. But then if you want to do something that looks, let's say, really good, when you talk about 3D modeling, where you say, oh yeah, I want to do a 3D model that looks triple A quality, then you sit there and then you suddenly realize, okay, yeah, I actually need to invest a month of time just to to make it look, to have a good looking model. And yeah. So I mean, in this case, when you try to do 3D modeling, then always keep an eye on the schedule. I mean, you should probably have a schedule, except if you just do it for fun, of course. But then you should, when you know how to use the program and you know what you want to create, then set a deadline. Like, okay, I'm gonna create a model every 2 weeks. So I cannot make it too complicated, not too detailed. Then because Elsie will be really frustrated that you worked on it for 2 weeks. But maybe if you do, let's say, a tank, then the only thing you got done was maybe the body. You didn't finish like the wheels or the tracks, and also not the turret, because you wanted to make the body look awesome.
Yeah.
So rather, just say, okay, I'm gonna make it more basic and actually finish the thing in time.
Yeah, you have to make sure you're focused on it in each part when you're doing each part, because doing the entire thing can be a daunting task, especially if it's a realistic tank. I mean, if you're making a low poly tank, then it's not gonna take as long as something like a realistic tank, because with a realistic tank you might spend like 5 hours creating a wheel because you want to get all the details in, like inside of the wheel and the tires and all that. Well, I guess I mean, I'm not 100% well versed. I guess the tracks and the inner wheels, I guess you wouldn't have tires anyway. But with something like a low poly tank, you might only have like tracks, or maybe the wheels inside are kind of just circles, or whatever. I guess 3D circles, cylinders. So
with textures. So
yeah. Yeah, exactly. So we should move on to that.
We should.
Yeah.
So let's talk about 2D stuff now.
Yeah.
We finished 3D modeling.
So I think.
Go on.
I guess we should probably start with explaining how you get the texture onto a model. We kind of briefly talked about UV unmapping, I think. So when you want to model something, obviously you need some way to tell it where the texture pieces are going to go. So like how the texture is actually going to wrap around a 3D model. And to do that, typically in any of those 3D tools, you'll have some unwrap feature. It'll either be called like UV unmapping or UV mapping, or unfolding or unwrapping. So there are multiple different ways of saying it, but basically what it is unfolding a 3D object to make it like flat, kind of like if, for example, if you had a piece of origami and then you took you unfolded it into a flat piece of paper and put it against your desk, all of those creases would kind of represent the faces of a model, kind of. So if you had a cube, obviously it has 6 faces, And when you unfold that, you'll see all the 6 faces against a 2D, I guess PNG, or however you'll get it out to be unwrapped. And so that way it's kind of establishing a coordinate system to say, okay, if I paint on this face, then it'll appear in 3D over there. So yeah, kind of just a reference. And to make those or to paint on those unwrapping, UV maps, you'll use software like Photoshop or GIMP, or even Blender, like we said, with hand painting. You don't even have to necessarily unwrap in that regard. But I guess let's kind of go over, the differences, I think, between Photoshop and GIMP, because those are what you'll expect to use for the most part, I think. So I'll start because I use Photoshop like pretty often, almost every day. And in Photoshop, if I'm making, I know that when I made textures for this dungeon game, I was using a tablet before, and I was hand painting all these creases between this dungeon rock floor. And then I made a normal map for it, which I don't want to get into right now, but so that was one option, was you could hand paint them, and it actually came out not looking bad. It looked all right. So hand painting is one option in Photoshop. The other option is you could download brushes or apply some effects. Like, I know some people, to make a metal-like texture, have just used the difference clouds filter, so that'll create like random 2D clouds in Photoshop. And then I think they applied like a Gaussian blur, which is a blur in multiple directions, like in X and Y, to make it look like a grayish, I guess kind of, I'm not sure how to describe it, kind of like concrete but metal is how it looked, sort of, that kind of effect there. So yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to, I guess, hack to make things look how you want them to look. Then there's also the option of painting. So yeah, and I think GIMP is kind of the same as Photoshop, but with limited features. So I think it's a good starting point. That's kind of what I have to say about it right now, I think. So yeah, what do you think?
I guess, yeah, my opinion is that, well, Photoshop, of course, I guess pretty much everyone knows Photoshop, because it's probably the most popular image creation tool on the market. And well, with Photoshop, you either have a full version or an elements version with less features than the full version. Yeah, so when people talk about Photoshop, they probably mostly talk about the full version, which is, well, Adobe moved to a subscription model now, and I think it's,
yeah, you can pay
$150 or something like that.
Well, you can no. You have two options. I think. Okay, so I know that if the cheapest plan is you can just pay $10 a month and it'll give you Photoshop and Lightroom. But then higher than that, I think if you get one individual Adobe piece of software, it's $20 a month. So like if I were to just get Illustrator, it'd be $20. I believe if you're a student, you pay $30 a month for everything. And then if you just want everything and you're not a student, then you pay $50 a month, I believe is how it works. So yeah, I mean, just if you want just Photoshop, then you can get it for just $10 a month. So it's not bad.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, actually, yeah, the subscription makes it a lot easier to pay, I think. But I don't know. Yeah, it
in
used
the
to
long
be.
run, it's gonna be more expensive.
Yeah, it used to be. The thing is, you would have to pay, I think, for each upgrade like hundreds of dollars, because like Photoshop was like 500 or 600.
No, it was in the thousands. It was not just.
I think no, you could get CS5
bucks.
for. I think you could get CS5 for around 500. Not sure though.
Now.
Now,
You
really?
mean now?
I don't know, a while ago. I don't know. Anyway, CS6 was the last one out there, so that's not
Okay.
happening anymore.
Yeah,
But yeah, I mean, you get updates with the subscription. I don't know how long I don't know if they'll introduce something new that'll remove that, but yeah, I mean, it's not too bad. $10 a month if you want it.
Anyway, so yeah, for Photoshop, well, everyone knows it, but there's some financial investment involved with, well, just getting it, and then with GIMP on the other hand, it's free. I think it's like it seems like there are less features compared to Photoshop, but I think it's just that most you can do pretty much everything that you can do with Photoshop, just that you don't have that many filters, and maybe you need to, like, the controls are just different from Photoshop, so it's maybe a bit more unintuitive to get into. Like, you don't even have a line tool. You need to press Shift and or hold Shift, and then you draw a line.
Like a
Like,
pencil.
you click
yeah.
once, then hold Shift, and then click somewhere else, and you draw a line.
Oh,
And
yeah.
in Photoshop, you have a line tool, or even in Paint, you have a line tool. So yeah, it's a bit unintuitive, but there's, I think, for if you want to have a program with advanced image editing capabilities, then GIMP is actually a pretty powerful tool. Just takes more time to get into. I mean, in Photoshop, you have all these, for example, text filters, where you say, yeah, drop shadow and then glow and whatever, apply texture to text, and it's just ticking a box. So of course it's much easier because you just type your text and then you say, yeah, I want to glow, make it glow red, and I want to have it not a big glow, but just on the, like, around the edges, like an outline. I think you can even put an outline and stuff like that. And then in GIMP, well, you need to maybe look up how can you actually do that.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I guess okay. The fundamentals are there, so I think you can obviously draw like with a tablet in GIMP, and you can do the stuff like you can obviously edit images and add blur and create squares. I don't know if GIMP has vector functionality. I think it might, but I think the big things that aren't in GIMP. Oh, okay. Yeah, I think the big things in GIMP that are like, well, the big things in Photoshop that aren't in GIMP are probably smart objects. So like in Photoshop, you're able to apply filters, but not like finalize them. But so basically, a smart object will be something where you can apply like pixel effects, like a blur or something else to a vector, and you'll still be able to move it around and manipulate it without the and then the raster effects, so the things that work by pixel, they'll still move with the object, and they'll just reapply once you move the smart object. So that's something that's nice about Photoshop. The other thing is how I think the blending modes. I don't know how advanced GIMP has gotten, but Photoshop has a lot of different options for how pixels will or I guess colors will interact with each other in the pixel system. So, for example, there's like normal and screen and blend and lots of different modes that don't matter when you're doing something like painting. So it's kind of more. It makes it easier for you to be able to do different things, I guess. But like obviously, if you want, you can get by with GIMP. I think it's more for advanced artists who should care about Photoshop, and you might just want to start with Photoshop if you're going to like always use Photoshop. But if you only want to use GIMP and you don't expect to have to use something as complex as Photoshop, then you could obviously just stick with GIMP. And either way, GIMP is a good starting point. So, because your skills will obviously translate over to Photoshop even more so than Blender to 3ds Max, I think, because GIMP, I mean, like image manipulation, you kind of are doing the same thing, but just with either fewer or more tools, I think. Whereas, yeah, go ahead.
And also, like the UI is kind of similar. Like you have a window for layers, you have a window for the toolbox, and for example, if you change your pencil tool, then you have a box that pops up where you can adjust like how big it's supposed to be, and how
I guess colors and all that.
Yeah, maybe it's a square and not a circle and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also color, visibility.
Yeah. So I mean that's kind of everything for texturing. Basically, UV map, and then you could import. I mean, yeah, kind of what the workflow would be is you would expect to UV unwrap in Blender, for example, and then say you import it to GIMP or Photoshop. You like put it, just open it up in Photoshop, and then what I would do is make a new layer over the UV map, and then either hand paint in it or I guess make a repeating texture and then apply that, or however else you would want to do it. If it's not a repeating texture, then you obviously care about the reference to where those faces end, so the outlines are important, and you might want a texture directly in it. But if it's something like a rock, then you might just you might not even need to UV unmap. Actually, if it's a repeating texture, you can kind of just apply it to a material. So yeah, I mean there are a couple of different workflows there, but I think for the most part you would unmap it, put it in Photoshop, and then make a couple layers above it, and then start editing in those inside the lines. So, yeah.
Yeah, layers are really magical when doing 2D, image editing. I think that's if somebody has no clue about creating art in a 2D image program like Photoshop or GIMP, you see all those nice looking pictures and you think, oh yeah, that's one layer, but then in the end it's like 20 layers on top of each other.
Yeah.
For example, you would kind of like paint the face and then you put a layer of hair on top. If you do art, of course.
Exactly.
But for modeling, of course, it makes sense to say, okay, for example, if you have a cube, then okay, you have 6 layers for the 6 faces. And so if you make a mistake in one face, then it doesn't carry over to like the other face. Or for example, you can also just select the area of one of the layer, so that way you can actually not paint into the other layers.
Yeah.
So in the other faces.
Yeah, so you can basically like erase, I guess, something when it's on a different layer, so that like if you have hair over a face, like you said, and then you mess up the hair and you want to erase it, that way you wouldn't erase the face below the hair. So
exactly.
Yeah. So yeah, I guess that's kind of everything I have about texturing. Any more thoughts?
Yeah, for me, pretty much as well. I guess everything that's like how to do stuff, how to do a specific task. You need to learn it yourself and look up tutorials. It's like paint like Van Gogh. No, it does not work like that. You actually, I mean, even if you see a tutorial and you give it a try, then that guy that is creating the tutorial is probably a very experienced user. So of course, in your first try, it's not gonna look as good as that guy's. Let's say maybe texturing or maybe a promotion text image or something like that.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. So I think the next thing we want to talk about is sprite creation. So that would be, sprites is actually a still image of 2D art, right? So
yeah, I guess.
Yeah. For example, if you
sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. If you think back, like the Super Nintendo games, those always used sprites.
Mm-hmm.
Well, except for stuff like Star Fox. But when you think sprites, then it's probably either classic games or indie games like what is it? I think Super Meat Boy is not sprites. But
no, I mean, it's
stuff like 1001 Spikes.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of expect any 2D game, I guess, to use sprites. But I guess a sprite sheet, like if you were to look up sprite sheet in Google, like I don't know, like Mario sprite sheet, for example, then you'd like see one of those texture atlases that has a bunch of pictures of Mario doing something different. So you'll probably have like a line of Mario's like jumping. So like you'll start on the ground and then he'll be a bit up and then a bit more up and then obviously in the center he's all the way up and then at the end all the way down. So it's kind of like
frame of his running animation, like left foot forward and then both at the same height, and then left foot back and the right foot front, and things like that. I think today sprite creation has kind of moved away from dot matrix sprites like in the past, where, for example, you have 32 times 32 pixel sized image. So in that case, you just draw pixel by pixel. And today, because resolutions are that high, I guess if you take a look at Super Meat Boy or a game like Skullgirls, they use sprites, but they don't look like traditional sprites.
Yeah.
Because it's more really a still art image. It's like you draw.
I mean they're really just detailed
drawings. Huh? Sorry.
I mean I guess they're just really detailed, right? I mean, if to kind of get in, actually this is like kind of why I want to get into vector art. I mean I always recommend like Illustrator for making sprites, which is Adobe's vector art program. If you want a free kind of Illustrator, I guess there's Inkscape out there, which I haven't used much, but I know that it's powerful and kind of achieve the same things as Illustrator for the most part. But yeah, so I mean, if you're one good reason, like you said, sprites aren't really pixelated anymore. So one good reason to use vector art for sprites is because you can, when you're making a vector art like character, it's going to have a bunch of vertices along a path. So when you have that path, you can kind of move it around to make, I guess, a different path to make the character do something different. So for example, like say you have a slime character that like jumps. So then if you have a bunch of paths along the bottom, you could like move the paths in so that the slime kind of like stretches upward when he jumps and that kind of thing. So, and then there's also, you can easily scale it because it's vector art. So, I should probably explain the big difference between vector art and pixel art, or pixel art is also called like raster art. Is that with pixels you can't really scale them because they're defined colors inside of defined squares, whereas vector art is math, making a calculation of, I guess, how to draw something, so that like once you scale it, it redraws it, rather than attempting to make, I guess, a bunch of pixels be colored in a similar way to how the smaller one was. So that's why vector art is really like useful for sprites, because you can kind of put them in a lot of different places, and then they'll still look the same. And you also have the ability to animate it, so like change different pieces of the model, like scale them and move them around without having any issues of losing quality. So, so yeah, I mean, like that's why my number one tool is like Illustrator or some other vector art program.
But I think, like when you do vector or vector graphics, I think it's fine to create one frame of animation with it, but if you do an animation with like changing vectors, like you said, like making a slime jump, for me it always looks kind of cheap, because you just see, okay, during the animation the model is just squeezing together, and like the text, not the texture, but like the image does not change. It's just the proportions that change.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's not just vector art. That's just a style of doing it. Though I mean, I think it depends on what your style is going to be. The thing is, with vector art, obviously you can manipulate it just the same as you can manipulate a pixel one. The difference is if you're drawing something, you're probably going to end up using pixel art. Like if you're hand drawing a character, like I don't know. Yeah, you mentioned Skullgirls. I don't know if he probably hand like draws them. So
yeah, it's everything. Everything is hand drawn, frame by frame.
So yeah, I mean that's like we talked about with layers. You probably have each piece on a different layer so that you can redraw them, and like not have to redraw literally everything. But you can also do that. So I mean, it depends on, I think, the complexity of the characters, and like what the sprite's going to be used for. So I mean, yeah, what were you gonna say about it?
I wanted to say that when you're using layers, that you can just use it as a reference. Like you can let the previous layer be shown, or like let's say the previous frame of the animation. Because if you, for example, have a walking animation, then well, maybe the head is the same, just the shoulders are moving or stuff like that. So you can also trace a lot, but the advantage of frame by frame animation is that it looks more natural, I think. Because I mean, okay, vector art is gonna, if you animate with vectors, it's gonna save you time, but of course you always need to think about how much time you have, and well, if it's just the slime maybe moving on the ground, maybe you can do vector animation and not make it look that obvious.
Well, the thing is, it's not they're not really an alternative because you can. I mean, when you're doing vector things, you can obviously still do it frame by frame. I wasn't saying you don't just like stretch it in a certain way. You have the ability to like move the path. So I mean, you can literally draw like a hand, for example, in Illustrator, and then like move everything just as you would like with you like pixel art, for example. But you just wouldn't be erasing it. You'd be modifying it a different way. Obviously, if you wanted to like erase it, you could just delete that path and then redraw a path. But yeah, I mean, I think it obviously depends. Like if you want to like characters that are really detailed, you'll probably paint them. I think that if if the character is more simplistic, you'll probably end up using vector art. So I mean, actually, I'd like to
You think so?
yeah, I mean, because when I mean, if the character is more simple, you can obviously just make him based on a shape, like a path. Like you just move because the path is a bunch of vertices. Basically, it's not like it has to be this shape and then that shape can be like squashed or stretched. I mean, it's just like yeah. I mean, it's kind of getting hard to explain, but I mean, they can kind of both be used for the same thing. It's just like if you can use vector art, it's like a good idea to go for it because of like the simplicity.
Okay.
But yeah, I think
My my what is it like? My experience is rather that people that don't want to, let's say, make really high detailed sprites, they just go for something like an 8-bit style, where you say, okay, you're gonna create animation like for the NES, where you, let's say, you have 16 times 16 sprites, so even smaller than Super Nintendo. So that in that case, you just have 16 times 16 pixel that you actually need to draw for every frame of animation. And by that, I guess maybe it's just that I played quite a lot of 2D pixel-based games that were more retro 8-bit style than vector animation. But at least my impression is that if you don't have like the resources, maybe time or persons that can draw detailed animation, the developer rather goes for a low resolution sprite than a high resolution vector image. Because for me, no matter how much or how good you manipulate the vector graphic, it still just looks like you're moving a still image. And if you draw even a small sprite frame by frame and by hand, then it looks more fluid.
the thing is, people like you said with like layering. I mean, people will do the same thing with vector art. So I mean, it's not really the difference isn't vector art. The difference is like the animation style. Like, I think what you're describing is like when people just kind of do a transformation on a still image, which can happen with either one, but like obviously you do it more commonly with vector art because vector art is able to squash that way and still be accurate. I agree, I don't like it either. That's not, but I mean, obviously that's like one art style. That's not really the difference between the two, though. I mean, the difference, I think, is... But yeah, like we said, the difference is literally just the math calculation versus the pixel coloring.
Do we have a good example for good-looking vector graphics?
The things I don't actually know because I haven't looked at. I mean, you've probably seen something that you've liked that was vector graphics. I mean, that's kind of what people will commonly talk about, like using vector for sprites. I think nowadays, but I think because like people will literally draw like with a pen, and just add on new vertices and stretch them or like move them around to manipulate like a character in a certain way. So I mean, it depends on like what the artist is. So like
Okay.
people kind of will draw like vector art, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I've never actually looked into it. I expect most 2D games with like a cartoony look to be like vector art. I'm not sure. Yeah, I can't really think of examples though, because I don't know either way. I can't think of examples for hand painting either. I mean, I guess we talked about Skullgirls, so there's that, and like all the old NES games, but
Well, even I think probably most 8-bit style games
yeah, of course.
are hand-drawn sprites, just low resolution. Well, homework for you: look up games that have good vector art animation.
Yeah.
I'm interested to hear what examples you got.
Okay. Yeah.
So
Well, I guess.
let's go back to the programs before we run out of time.
Yeah.
So you talked about Inkscape, and I also used Inkscape a bit, and I think it's pretty easy to get into. It's really intuitive, and yeah, it's also completely free. Also has layers as features, and yeah, so even yeah, also you can also create vectors in Inkscape. So
Yeah, and it has all this. I think it
I
has
think
the same fundamental tools. I mean, the most important thing is the pen tool, so that
yeah,
works the same way.
I think it's a pretty good program. I think you can compare it to GIMP, just that Inkscape is easier to get into, but maybe it's not gonna take you as far as GIMP might get you, like on a skill level. I'm not saying Inkscape is a bad tool. I maybe it's just more limited. But well, if you want to get into image creation, I think you can even use it for texturing. So maybe
Yeah.
if you want to have an easy entry and just give it a try, then maybe Inkscape is actually a good program to take a look at, to just see if you're actually good at maybe drawing.
Yeah. I guess. Do you want to talk about I guess bone animation now, or?
No. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, okay. So we talked about like animation with, I guess, redrawing every frame, and there's also like either transforming every frame for like a less like realistic change. So then there's also like the option of using some tool to make 2D bone animation, which I think it's one that you wouldn't expect as much as like other tools. Is that like with bone animation you can move a vector, like for example if you have a separate like hand object and then you have an elbow, you could say, okay, this is where my character's bones are and I want them to be able to move in a different way. And so, you know, there are games where you can, it's not hard to tell if a game has bone animation because it kind of has this distinct look of how the, I guess, arm moves, which is yeah. So I mean, it's like something that Jan doesn't like. I don't know that I mean I don't. Yeah, it's like I don't like how it's limiting, but I think it can look like fine. I don't. But yeah, it's definitely hard to like stylize in different ways with bone animation because it's like moving a hand, but only on one axis. So, so well, actually, only on two axes. Sorry. So yeah. So that's a thing. And there's one tool to use is called Spriter. I don't actually know of any other tools. I know that there are other tools, but I don't know their names for doing bone animation. But I know that there's Spriter will let you like choose where elbows and shoulders are and how the animation will look, and so you can create like 2D animations pretty quickly with that. If you want to like use a still image, but then just have limbs that will do certain things like I don't know, hit with a sword or fire a gun, stuff like that. So yeah, I mean that's that's the third option for animating, I guess, sprites.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Because maybe that's the most difficult animation method to make actually look natural.
Yeah, I think in like smaller motions, probably like recoil of a gun, it would probably look okay. But like once you like the more complex the animations get, the harder it is to make them look good. I think with bone animation.
I know that some Japanese indie fighting games used bone animation, and oh god, it looks so bad.
It sounds funny.
It like if you have a standing animation, then you have kind of a still image, but it's moving, like.
Yeah, the thing is with the with the human, if you see those arms like if you see the shoulder like moving separately from like the body, then it's like a really weird effect. So.
Yeah, but I mean it just doesn't look natural, because even if your arms move, then like maybe you turn your hand, or you just like let's say you move your arm forward, like you have it near your body and then you move it forward, then the elbow goes like if you have the left arm, then the elbow is going to go left from your body, and then it's going to extend forward, right? So like the depth if you have a 3D a three-dimensional image, you would also have a z-axis movement. But with bone animation, it's like you would take the arm stretched out forward, and then you move it closer to the body without actually moving like the elbow. It looks really strange. I'm just not a big fan of it. Or at least for fighting games, of course, yeah. If you don't have, if you suck at drawing or you don't have the time, maybe then yeah, maybe bone animation is something for you. But for maybe I'm just the guy that thing, or I think if you do something, then do it properly. So even if I suck at drawing and maybe I don't have that much time, then I would say, okay, I rather draw everything by hand and make it stylized, like simplistic stylized,
yeah.
then create one good image and use that for all animations.
Yeah, I would agree that it sounds like I haven't seen a fighting game that uses bone animation, but I think it sounds very strange because because like how we said, there's so much going on. So I mean, like you have a bunch of complex like animations going on with just bone animation that probably would look somewhat strange. So yeah, I mean, you think obviously you want to take in. I mean, art is art, and obviously you can do whatever you want to, and it'll look how you can make it look how you want to. But things are going to look more strange than other things, like no matter what. So I mean, like something like a fighting game, probably like bone animation might look pretty strange because like if your character is like rolling around or doing really fast motions and like you just see his hand moving at the same speed and like bone animation will probably look awkward, I think. So
I guess
mean, yeah.
the the body just moves too much, or like
Yeah.
too many body parts move, so it looks awkward.
Yeah. But yeah,
Anyway,
I think
yeah,
if you're
sorry.
making a character, then you probably are going to repaint each time. So like you'll probably even if it's a vector or if it's a pixel art, either way you're probably going to like redraw or repaint each frame. If you unless if you're not an artist, then you might just try to make a vector and then move things around, or you might use bone animation. But yeah, but otherwise, like if it's a UI element or an icon, or it's something like a coin, like props, you'll probably end up using like a vector, I think, just because like it's easy to scale those and they don't really need animation. Um, but yeah, I think for the most part, if it's a character, you'll probably end up painting it like you said. Um, so yeah, I think like Adobe Illustrator would be like my recommendation for vector art. Start with Inkscape, and kind of like what we said with texturing or painting, Photoshop is a good painting tool. There's also like, what else is there? Clip Studio is also really popular for painting, and I think Manga Studio as well. So yeah, I mean, those kind of make it more simple to like draw without having to worry about all the other features. So that's a nice experience. I personally use Photoshop to paint, and then I just like hit F twice to like make it focused view, so you don't have any of the other tools in the way.
Okay.
So yeah, and then obviously you'd want to start with GIMP if you don't want to pay anything, I think, for pixel art. And yeah, so yeah, that's what I think about sprite making.
Pretty much just use all the free tools like GIMP, Inkscape, Blender.
Yeah. Yeah, I think obviously at least start with them is a good idea, unless you want to like invest right away and specialize in a software. So
Yeah, but I think even like professional artists don't all use Photoshop. Some use other tools as well that are, what is it, like Corel Draw, for example.
well, yeah, I mentioned at least two others. I know that, yeah, I mean, like lots of people will use Clip Studio. Lots of people will use like I mean, there's a lot out there that everybody will use. It's not like Photoshop is the one to paint with. So
Yeah. There are so many programs that you can use, so many options. So yeah, I think we can just recommend or give you examples what you can use for a specific purpose. But of course, you can also use a program maybe you're already used to using, or maybe your favorite artist is using, and you want to give it a try. Then of course you can use that as well. So Bilal, let's end our talk for today, but maybe some final questions at the end that some listeners will probably think about, and before they actually have to ask us, let's just answer them in advance. So when you actually want to do, for example, texturing or drawing sprites, do you need a tablet, like an art tablet to draw, or would mouse also be acceptable?
In my opinion, if you're drawing a character, like if it's pixel art and you're painting one, then or not pixel art. I don't want to say pixel art as an 8-bit, but like a high resolution like drawing, then a mouse is not a good idea, because like I mean you don't draw in real life with a mouse. It's difficult to like get that precise movement. So I mean, yeah, I would recommend some kind of tablet for drawing rasterized art. But for vector art, then a mouse is fine, because you just have to move vertices. You don't have to have an accurate stroke or anything like that. So
I think for sprites, like low resolution sprites, mouse should also be fine because you
For like
draw
8-bit, yeah.
dot by dot anyway.
exactly.
So that would also be sufficient. And well, when you buy a tablet, then maybe you should give those a try first before you buy one, because they can get really expensive. Of course, you have basic models that cost $50, $70, and then you have models that have a built-in screen with a preview that you actually draw on. So it's kind of like you're drawing on paper.
Yeah.
And those are quite expensive, as you can imagine.
Yeah. My first tablet was a $70 one without a screen, which is it was the Wacom Intuos Pro at the time. So I mean that one was that one you put it on your desktop and draw on it while looking at the monitor, and that worked all right for the time. Now I have a Huion, I think GT191 or something, it was around 400, and that one has a built-in screen and like 8192 pressure sensitivity. So I mean that's you don't have to get a Wacom one. You can get there less expensive options, but yeah, $400 is still an investment. So if you want to try them out, you probably would want to start with one that doesn't have a screen built in.
And else, what did I also note down? I guess we already talked about free tools, and if they are good enough, yes, they are.
Yes.
And no, that's. We also talked about the workflow, what you should focus on with 3D modeling. No, then, yeah, all my questions are already answered. Maybe do you have anything you want to add that you kind of thought about?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. I guess when you do art, you also need to pay attention to your screen, because screens show colors differently. So if you want to do it professionally, then yeah, you might need to invest into a more expensive monitor that shows colors correctly, and not just some cheap notebook screen. Those are, well, really different from screen to screen. So just that as a reminder at the end of the podcast. I guess you don't have any comments anymore, Bilal, right?
Well, I just wanted to say, I think a lot of the stuff that we talked about is kind of like you can kind of interpret like what it is you're going to do with art, because I mean it's art, so you can obviously do things in a different way. Like the purpose of this is kind of just to say what standards are, so that makes it more simple to like get into. So yeah, I mean obviously if you want to like draw in a different way, there's also the option of drawing on paper and that kind of thing. So I mean with art, it's kind of whatever you do is like your thing. Like you can obviously stylize how you want and draw how you want to. But yeah, like I said, we just want to give out standards so that it can be more easy to get into, I think.
Exactly. Just like recommendations how you can, well, get into a topic more easily to learn about it, if it's something for you or not.
Yeah.
So, all right, then that's episode 9 for today. Next week we are going to have our kind of anniversary episode where we will continue to talk about tools.
Yeah.
So we had game engines today. We had modeling and drawing tools, and then just we will decide what we want to talk about next during this week. So maybe it's music tools, maybe it's like website creation tools. We will see. So
Yep.
just look forward to it. And as always, thank you for listening. Feel free to comment in the YouTube comment section. We would be very happy if you comment a lot. And else, yeah, that's it. And I hope you'll listen to us again next week.